It's Ken Harbaugh with the MeidasTouch Network. This is what it looks like when a country fights back against an authoritarian and wins. Peter Magyar just won a landslide victory in Hungary, a supermajority, ending Viktor Orbán's 16-year grip on power, and hundreds of thousands of Hungarians poured into the streets to celebrate. This matters far beyond Hungary. For years, Orban was the proof of concept for the global authoritarian right. He wasn't just an ally of MAGA, he was the template. Steve Bannon called him a hero. Tucker Carlson broadcast his show from Budapest. Trump hosted Orban at Mar-a-Lago. And just last week, JD Vance flew to Budapest to appear on stage with Orban 5 days before the election, a last-ditch effort to save a fellow authoritarian. It didn't work. What Orban built, the rigged media landscape, the weaponized judiciary, the cult of Christian nationalism wrapped in a flag, it was all repudiated decisively. With nearly 80% turnout, over 3 million Hungarians looked at 16 years of corruption, oligarchy, and assaults on democracy and said, enough. The implications extend across the continent. The roughly 90 billion euros in aid allocated to Ukraine by the European Union has been unfrozen. Hungary's hostility to Ukraine is ending, and NATO no longer has to deal with a saboteur within the alliance. And crucially, Vladimir Putin loses his last reliable advocate inside the EU. But there's a critical lesson here for us in the US. The MAGA movement saw what Orban did with the courts, with the press, with the election maps, and they took notes, which means they will also study how Orban lost, and they will adapt. We have midterms coming, and if there's one thing Trump and his allies are disciplined about, it is learning from failure and applying those lessons. Do not assume that what brought Orban down automatically translates here. The threats to fair elections, to a free press, to an independent judiciary, those threats are going to evolve. So stay alert, get organized, and think about what these faces represent. They may belong to Hungarians today, but soon that will be us. Because these are the faces of people who loved their country enough to fight for it. We will feel that here, when we have finally consigned Trumpism to the dustbin of history, when the authoritarian project he adapted from Orban and inflicted on this country has been discredited, dismantled, and defeated. The day is coming when this scene will play out across America's cities and towns, when those flags will be the stars and stripes. Today, I'm joined by someone who has spent her career tracking exactly how these authoritarian movements operate, where they get their money, how they coordinate across borders, and how democracies can fight back. Olga Lautman is a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, one of the foremost researchers on Russian and transnational organized crime networks, and a leading expert on how Kremlin influence operations penetrate Western political systems. She has tracked the financial and ideological threads connecting Putin's apparatus to far-right movements across Europe and the United States, including the networks that propped up Orban and that continue to work inside our own politics. She's one of the most clear-eyed voices on what authoritarian capture actually looks like from the inside and what it takes to defeat it. Here's my conversation with Olga Lautman. Olga Lautman, thanks so much for joining us today. Tell us why we should care so much about this Hungarian election. I mean, by the numbers, Hungary only has 10 million people. It ranks about, the middle of the scales in terms of GDP within the EU, about middle of the pack when it comes to defense spending. But clearly something seismic happened with this election. You saw the outpouring of pent up, not just frustration, but hope on the streets of Budapest and around the country. Apparently, Magyar had to campaign everywhere but the big cities because he had no access to the media, to billboards, and it worked. It worked. Why are we so happy about this?
I know. It's reminiscent of 1989. It really is. And when a lot of the hostages under the Soviet Union finally got their freedom and the happiness that just radiated, like you didn't even know what to do with this freedom. And this is the same thing. You've had Orban, who has had control of the country for 16 years. This is like the most corrupt, leader that in in Europe. And the fact that he's had power for so long, and it was like a lot of people thought it would be impossible to get rid of him. And here you have, and this is one thing that people in America really, 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 really need to learn. You had, the parties there who basically stepped aside, like the socialist parties and other parties who had no shot, and said, you know what, we are going to step out and give this, whoever has the best shot to defeat Orban, this is who we're going to push forward. It wasn't about them. It wasn't about their parties. It wasn't about them having power like here, how people don't want to leave campaigns because it's all about them. There, they had one goal of defeating Orban, and it worked. And I mean, the outpouring across the country, and you just feel that energy and that hope. And it's important for everyone across Europe, for America, and for anyone right now who is dealing with this, tilt towards authoritarianism. It's extremely important. And the one thing I'll say is that Orban was key because he was a linchpin between Kremlin operations and between the far-right movements across Europe and the United States. I mean, he literally was the one. There's absolutely zero coincidence that he was heffing back and forth during election in 2024, meeting with Trump constantly. There was a good investigation how in the prior Fico election in Slovakia, not this one, the prior one, but I'm sure the same thing happened with this one, how he was the middleman between the Kremlin and Russia's intelligence operations in his campaign. And the Kremlin at that time successfully managed to put Fico into power. And Orban was the one going back and forth from Russia to Slovakia, back and forth. And that's it. So that is why he is so important, because he really is the middle of this movement between the Kremlin and MAGA and the AfD in Germany and the National Party, or whatever it's called now, National Front in France, and all these far-right movements.
I want to get to some of that, especially the relevance to Ukraine, but remind us how much of the authoritarian project Orban was able to implement in his 16 years. He wasn't just playing around the edges of democracy. He was undermining it at every chance with universities and with the media, with empowering oligarchs, taking over every aspect of society that he could. And he had a good 16-year run. Remind us how much damage he was able to inflict.
A lot of damage. I mean, he rewrote the Constitution. And like you said, he took over the universities. He took over, which, by the way, he gave a blueprint for every authoritarian. And this is why you saw, for instance, in the U.S. with Trump, there is no coincidence that one of the first things Trump did when he came back into power was start attacking universities, because this is one of the main things that authoritarians want to see, is the NGOs, the universities, the media.
It was also because Orban specifically did it. I mean, there were pilgrimages by MAGA influencers to Hungary to learn from Orban. Can you talk about the central role he played in motivating MAGA ideology specifically, not just authoritarians writ large, but he was like an ideological father of the MAGA movement in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. And you had, like, for instance, Tucker Carlson's father who worked for him. You had Steve Bannon who worked for him. He really gave the blueprint for MAGA. You had a lot of the CPAC Hungarian events. You had a lot of the influencers traveling back and forth. And he basically gave this roadmap of becoming a dictator, seizing, control of all the key areas in order to take grip on the country.
It's Ken Harbaugh. Quick break to let everyone know that the Meidas Studios and Valor Media Network original short film, Drone Hunters of Kherson, We'll have 2 in-person screenings in Washington, D.C. on April 21st and 23rd. I'll be there as part of a panel discussion afterwards that includes members of Congress and other experts. This is a free event open to the public, but register soon because spots are going fast. The RSVP link is in the notes below. Here's the trailer for Drone Hunters of Kherson.
Drone. The contest between who gets who first. Do they get the drone, or does the drone get them? We're that close to the front. There's a rubble everywhere, but people are still surviving. We just got an alert that there is a wave of 12 Shaheeds flying in over the Black Sea. There! That's the amazing thing about this war. It's a blend of trench warfare and Terminator.
For everyone who, for instance, was in shock that JD Vance showed up, people have short-term memory because I'm old enough to remember during, 2023, 2024, when JD Vance was a senator, he was one of the main architects of doing everything in Senate to stop the aid and weapons going to Ukraine. And how did he do it? This was organized through Heritage Foundation, which, interestingly enough, as soon as Orban got involved with the Heritage Foundation a few years ago, this old think tank that used to be very anti-Soviet, anti-Russian, and, arguably somewhat normal, suddenly shifted. And you saw around, I believe it was 2021, 2022, where you saw this big shift, suddenly pro-Kremlin, anti-Ukraine, anti-democracy, anti-everything, and Orban had a lot of his Hungarian agents, besides the fact he was funneling money through there. He also was running operations via his agents who would come to Heritage Foundation, organize this, events with congressional, for instance, and what I was speaking with congressional members like Marjorie Taylor Greene and JD Vance and others, in order for them to do everything to prevent aid and weapons going to Ukraine. And it worked. I mean, it was very successful. Eventually, the packages would go through. But I mean, at one point, I remember Marjorie Taylor Greene doing everything to, I thought she was literally going to throw herself to stop the vote because of how desperate she was working for her money to stop this votes. And JD Vance was key to that. He was one of the key people in Senate who did this. And this is why you see here when he ends up going to campaign for Orban, this is basically a continuation of what he was doing and carrying out Russia's orders with Orban as the middleman, the cutout.
If we can find a way to get JD Vance to campaign for every Republican in a swing state in our midterm election, I want to make that happen because by all accounts, his parachuting into Budapest and cozying up to Orban was the kiss of death. I mean, the poll numbers for Orban in the days after that absolutely plummeted. I know you can't make a one-to-one comparison, but it feels like everyone in Trump's orbit is living in this fantasy world where they think people actually respond positively to what they have to offer. And it's just the opposite. And it couldn't have happened to a better person. JD Vance strikes out in Hungary. He strikes out in Pakistan. He's on a real roll here, and I wish him all the best. But can you talk about the role of the American government in trying to swing this election? Probably to a less intrusive degree than the Russians, but we put our thumb on the scale, not we collectively, but the Trump regime was desperate, absolutely desperate to keep Orban in power, and all of their efforts appeared to have backfired.
Absolutely. And I actually wrote an article about this on Substack. This actually was a joint U.S.-Russian effort, operation to Orban. So Russia provided all the information warfare. They flooded Telegram with like thousands of accounts that pushed pro-Orban stuff, anti-Orban. Of course, you had the vote buying. They literally used the same tactics they just used in Romania and Moldova that they perfected in Ukraine over the decades every time they get involved in an election there. So Russia was so invested in this that they actually sent GRU agents and FSB agents months ago into Hungary, stationed them there in order to run these operations. And it was a whole mixture of operations, information warfare.
I want to pause there. I want to pause for just a second because I want to roll this clip of a subway station in Budapest with, it looks like thousands of Hungarians saying, and I wish I knew it in Hungarian, but they're saying Russia out.
Russia go home.
Russia go home. And you know, it's not symbolic, it's literal. Like, get your agents out of our country. That's what they're saying.
Yeah.
How do you react to that, Olga? That visceral reaction to this attempt by a former superpower to steal an election?
Yeah, so I am actually very happy because honestly, Hungarians are the first ones. And this is what was really distressing because Orban became a puppet of Putin for already a few decades. And I mean, arguably, there were investigations over a decade ago of how it was done, that he was compromised by one of Russia's mafia people, main ones who set a base in Budapest and whatnot. But for a few decades, he's been a Kremlin puppet. And it always made me scratch my head because, I mean, Hungarians should be old enough to remember when Russia's Soviet tanks were running protesters over. So the fact that they were, okay with their regime cozying up to Russia was extremely bizarre. And it feels like finally they remembered those Hungarian tanks. I mean, those Soviet tanks running their ancestors over, and that's it. But it was incredible. And I mean, this was not the first. There were protests with Russians go home. I think it's Rusik Haza. They were screaming to get them out. And that's it. But as I was saying, Russia provided the information warfare, the agents on the ground, even to the point of Orban's party was bringing care packages to voters to try to buy votes, which is a very Russian thing. They'll give you kielbasa and sunflower oil and everything else. Here, don't forget to vote. But U.S. ran a joint operation. And what worries me, and I mean, it worried me more so last year than now. But if you look at Trump's what is it called? The national strategy, security strategy?
Yeah. October of last year, the national security strategy. Yep.
If you look at that strategy, I mean, he basically said in the strategy that the United States was going to use all tools available. Intelligence services, whatever needs to be done in order to prop up all the far-right parties across Europe and to overthrow the democratic governments, which is Russia's project. Here, they attempted to do it with Orban. Luckily, Trump, and Vance, and this whole regime, I mean, anyone who looks at U.S. right now, even the far-right parties in Europe are looking and they're like, what a banana republic. We don't want any of this here. So you have even all the far-right parties that have turned. So it's very reassuring, but this was the first joint Russian and American operation where you had the highest levels of power in the U.S. government working jointly with the Russian government in order to try to keep, Russia's proxy and Trump's, BFF in power. They attempted to do it via MAGA influencers in Romania and in Moldova and Albania. You even had in Albania Trump's former campaign manager Lasavita, who was working and attempting to try to put, this person that Russia backed in power, but that didn't work. So the MAGA brand is luckily it's dying, but it just shows you how close, you have the MAGA movement, Trump, and the Kremlin and Putin, how close they are, with their goals of propping up these far-right movements, and basically anything that is illiberal and anything that, will anyone who will subvert democracies.
That was an excerpt of my conversation with Olga Lautman. For the full interview, check out my Substack. The link is below. Thanks.
Love this video? Support independent media and unlock exclusive content, ad-free videos, and custom emojis by becoming a paid member of our YouTube channel today. You can also gift memberships to others. Let's keep growing together.